A seemingly ordinary flight takes a shocking turn when a wealthy woman is humiliated for her old attire. But the truth about her identity will leave everyone in awe. Watch as respect, power, and justice unfold in this unforgettable moment on board. The luxury of the business class cabin enveloped its passengers in an aura of exclusivity. Plush leather seats, ambient lighting, and the quiet hum of the engines created a space that promised comfort for those deemed worthy of its cost. Among this scene of opulence, the appearance of an elderly woman standing quietly at one of the aisle seats was a stark anomaly. She wore a traditional dress that had long passed its prime. The fabric, though once vibrant, was now faded, with frayed edges and delicate stitching that hinted at years of wear. Her diminutive frame seemed almost out of place amidst the grandeur, yet her posture was upright, her expression calm. Her presence, while unassuming, was enough to draw curious glances. Grace Harper, a young flight attendant with sharp features and a meticulously polished uniform, approached the woman. Her heels clicked against the carpeted floor as she halted before the elderly passenger. A practiced smile curved her lips, but the coldness in her gay gaze betrayed her thoughts. "Ma'am, this is the business class cabin," Grace said, her tone polite but firm. "Your seat must be in the economy section. Please return to your assigned seat." The elderly woman didn't immediately respond. Instead, she looked up at Grace with a calm but steady gaze. In her hands, she held a boarding pass, its edges creased from being tightly gripped. For a moment, she seemed poised to speak, but instead, she extended the ticket silently toward the attendant. Grace hesitated, glancing briefly at the ticket before her eyes flicked back to the elderly woman's attire. A faint sneer tugged at the corners of her mouth. "Ma'am," she repeated, louder this time, her voice slicing through the quiet hum of the cabin. "Do you understand what I'm saying? This is business class. It's not a place for someone dressed like this." Her words lingered in the air, sharp and deliberate. Passengers began to take notice. A man in a tailored suit sitting nearby lowered his newspaper, his brow furrowed in mild curiosity. A younger woman across the aisle, sipping champagne, smirked as she exchanged amused glances with her companion. Whispers traveled down the rows, punctuated by soft chuckles. The attention in the cabin shifted, like the spotlight of a stage, to the elderly woman standing at the center. But the woman remained motionless, her expression unchanged. The faint lines on her face spoke of age and wisdom. Yet there was a peculiar calmness in her demeanor, as if she had weathered far greater storms than this moment of public scrutiny. Her silence, far from submissive, seemed almost deliberate. Grace's irritation flared. This lack of response felt like defiance, and in her mind, it needed to be addressed swiftly. "Look, ma'am," she said, her voice sharper now, her frustration barely concealed. "You're disrupting the cabin. If you don't move to your correct seat, I'll have no choice but to call the captain to handle this situation. Trust me, you don't want that." The elderly woman's grip on her ticket tightened, her knuckles whitening as if to steady herself. Her gaze remained fixed on Grace, unflinching. Around them, the atmosphere grew tense. The soft murmurs of amusement gave way to an expectant hush, broken only by the occasional sound of a camera phone clicking or the faint hum of a passenger typing. Some had started recording, eager to capture what they anticipated would be an entertaining encounter. Grace took a step back, folding her arms, her irritation shifting into a display of control. "Very well," she said, a small, mocking smile playing on her lips. "We'll settle this properly. Let's see what the captain has to say about this situation." As Grace turned sharply and began her brisk walk toward the back of the cabin to contact the cockpit, the elderly woman slowly lowered herself into the seat assigned on her boarding pass. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the fabric of her dress, but her expression remained composed. Behind her, whispers grew louder as passengers speculated and shared smirks. Yet, despite the scrutiny, the woman sat still, her back straight, and her eyes fixed ahead. There was something unshakable in her demeanor, something that seemed to cut through the shallow judgment surrounding her. Unbeknownst to those watching, the calm she exuded was not one of submission, but of quiet power, a power that would soon ripple through the cabin, altering the course of the flight and the lives of those aboard. Grace Harper returned moments later, striding back into the cabin with a renewed air of authority. Her sharp eyes scanned the elderly woman, now seated quietly, as if she belonged nowhere else but in that very chair. Yet the sight only fueled Grace's irritation. "Ma'am," she began, her voice cutting through the tense silence, "you seem to have misunderstood me. That seat is not for you." She gestured at the woman's dress, her perfectly manicured nails pointing like accusations. "This isn't a second-hand market where you can just claim whatever you like. This is business class, and we have standards here." The elderly woman didn't flinch. Her hands clutched her crumpled boarding pass, and though her face bore the lines of time and hardship, her calm composure remained unbroken. Her silence seemed to frustrate Grace even further. Passengers began to murmur again, their whispers weaving through the tension like invisible threads. A man in a navy blazer leaned toward his neighbor, muttering something about how people should know their place. Others smirked openly, their eyes flicking between the attendant and the elderly woman as if watching a spectacle unfold for their entertainment. Grace took a step closer, lowering her voice but making it no less venomous. "I don't know what you're trying to prove here," she said, her tone dripping with contempt. "You're clearly not meant to be here. That dress? Honestly, it's embarrassing to even look at. Where did you get it? A flea market? Or maybe it was just handed down, threadbare and all." She laughed softly, a cruel sound that made a few passengers chuckle along with her. Still, the elderly woman said nothing. Her grip on the ticket tightened, and her knuckles turned white against the faded paper. Her eyes, dark and steady, remained fixed on Grace, unyielding in their quiet defiance. The calm in the woman's gaze unsettled Grace in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't the meekness of someone who felt out of place. It was something else, something that spoke of a strength Grace didn't expect. But rather than back down, she doubled down, determined to break through the wall of silence. "Do you even know what business class is?" Grace sneered, raising her voice slightly so others could hear. "It's for people who've earned it. People who've worked hard, who can afford luxury. Not someone like you, who clearly has no idea what that means. You don't belong here." A few passengers exchanged glances, their smirks fading as the tension escalated. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that the line between enforcement and humiliation had been crossed. Yet no one intervened. The cabin remained a passive audience, watching as Grace's words grew sharper, more cutting. The elderly woman finally stirred. She didn't speak, but she unfolded her ticket with deliberate care, smoothing it out with trembling hands. Then, as if to answer the unspoken question lingering in the air, she held it up for Grace to see. The attendant snatched the ticket, her polished nails brushing against the woman's gnarled fingers. Her eyes scanned the details, her lips pursed as she read. For a brief moment, her confident expression faltered, but it was fleeting. "Well," Grace said, her tone tinged with mockery, "it seems there's been some sort of mistake. You do have a business class seat, but honestly..." She gestured again at the woman's attire, her gaze sweeping over the faded fabric with exaggerated disdain. "Just because you have the ticket doesn't mean you belong here. Look around." She motioned toward the other passengers, many of whom were watching intently. "Do you see anyone else dressed like that? Do you think this is how people present themselves in business class?" The elderly woman's lips parted slightly, as if she might finally respond, but then she pressed them together again. Her silence, her refusal to be goaded, only seemed to enrage Grace further. "Let me make this simple for you," Grace continued, her voice cold and deliberate. "If you insist on staying here, at least have the decency to show some respect for the space. People like you. You lower the standard for everyone else." A murmur rippled through the cabin, this time less amused and more uneasy. A woman seated nearby shifted in her seat, glancing at Grace with a furrowed brow. A younger man further back muttered something under his breath, his eyes narrowing as he watched the scene unfold. Yet still, no one spoke up. The cabin remained silent, save for the faint whispers and the steady hum of the engines. The elderly woman lowered her ticket slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she placed it on the armrest. Her gaze lifted, meeting Grace's eyes once more. There was no anger in her expression, no trace of the humiliation the attendant seemed determined to provoke. Instead, there was something far more disarming. Quiet dignity. It was a dignity that spoke louder than any words could have. a reminder that true strength often lay not in defiance, but in the ability to endure. And though she hadn't said a word, her presence had begun to shift something in the room, an invisible weight pressing down on those who had laughed, who had sneered, who had watched in silence. Grace, however, refused to acknowledge it. She turned on her heel, her irritation now barely masked, and walked briskly toward the galley. "I'll deal with this," she muttered under her breath, disappearing through the curtain. The cabin remained hushed in her absence. The elderly woman sat still, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Around her, the air was thick with unspoken tension, as if the entire cabin were holding its breath, waiting for what might happen next. When Grace Harper returned to the cabin, her face was set in an icy mask of determination. The murmurs among the passengers had grown louder during her absence. And several people now had their phones out, angling them subtly, or not so subtly, toward the elderly woman and the flight attendant. The scene had turned into an impromptu spectacle, and Grace was keenly aware of being both the center of attention and the perceived enforcer of order. She didn't care. If anything, the growing audience only solidified her resolve to assert control. As she approached the elderly woman's seat again, her heels clicked sharply against the floor, announcing her presence like a judge entering the courtroom. "Ma'am," she said, her voice louder this time, as if the sheer volume would intimidate the elderly woman into compliance. "I'm giving you one final chance. Either move back to economy where you belong, or I will have to involve the captain." The elderly woman didn't even look up this time. Her gaze remained fixed on her lap, her hands resting lightly on the armrest, as if the weight of Grace's threats couldn't touch her. The calmness in her demeanor was infuriating, and Grace felt her cheeks flush with frustration. Nearby, a burst of muffled laughter erupted from a group of younger passengers in designer tracksuits, their phones pointed unabashedly at the unfolding drama. "Oh, man, this is gonna go viral." One of them whispered loudly enough for others to hear, his smirk widening as he nudged his friend. "Better get her to move, lady," another chimed in, grinning at Grace. "Looks like she's more stubborn than you thought." Grace shot them a withering glare before turning back to the elderly woman. "This isn't a game," she said, her tone sharp and clipped. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? By refusing to cooperate, you're disrupting the entire flight." She took a step closer, leaning down slightly as if to emphasize her authority. "Do you really want to risk being banned from flying altogether? Because trust me, I can make that happen." For the first time, the elderly woman shifted in her seat, tilting her head slightly to meet Grace's gaze. Her eyes, deep and steady, held none of the fear or uncertainty Grace expected. Instead, there was a quiet defiance in them, a strength that made Grace falter for just a fraction of a second. But she recovered quickly. Straightening up, she folded her arms and glanced around the cabin, as if rallying the passengers to her side. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice ringing out with exaggerated authority, "I apologize for this disruption. As you can see, we have someone here who is refusing to follow the rules." She gestured toward the elderly woman, her hand sweeping dramatically in her direction. "Unfortunately, I may have to escalate this matter to ensure the comfort and safety of everyone on board." The laughter from the younger passengers grew louder, their voices now openly mocking. "Ooh, she's gonna call the captain," one of them said, holding up his phone as if narrating a live-streamed reality show. "Granny's in trouble now." Another passenger, a middle-aged man in a crisp suit, frowned and glanced at Grace. "Is this really necessary?" he muttered, his voice low but audible enough for those nearby to hear. "The woman isn't causing any harm. Why not just let her sit?" Grace whipped around to face him, her professional veneer cracking under the strain of her growing frustration. "Sir, I appreciate your input, but this is a matter of protocol. If everyone decided to sit wherever they wanted, there would be chaos." She turned back toward the elderly woman, her expression hardening. "Now, ma'am, for the last time, move, or I'll have no choice but to involve the captain." The cabin fell silent, the weight of the threat hanging heavily in the air. Even the younger passengers with their phones seemed to sense that the confrontation was reaching a critical point. All eyes were on the elderly woman, waiting to see if she would finally react. But instead of fear or anger, she simply leaned back in her seat, her movements deliberate and calm, and spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried a weight that made everyone pause. "I bought this ticket," she said simply, holding Grace's gaze. "I have the right to sit here." Her words, though few, struck like a hammer. The simplicity of her statement, combined with her unshakable composure, made it clear that she wasn't going to be intimidated. Grace felt her jaw tighten. "Fine," she said, her voice sharp with annoyance. "If that's how you want to play this, I'll get the captain involved." She turned and marched toward the cockpit, her heels clicking furiously against the floor. As she disappeared through the curtain, the cabin erupted into hushed whispers. Some passengers leaned toward each other, speculating on what might happen next. Others glanced at the elderly woman, their expressions a mix of curiosity and newfound respect. "She's got guts," one of the younger passengers murmured, lowering his phone for the first time. Another nodded, his smirk replaced by something closer to admiration. "Yeah, she's not backing down." Meanwhile, the elderly woman sat quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Though her expression remained calm, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that hinted at a strength far greater than anyone in the cabin had yet realized. Whatever was about to happen, it was clear that this was no ordinary passenger, and the story unfolding in business class was far from over. Grace Harper stormed down the aisle toward the back of the cabin, her sharp breaths matching the staccato rhythm of her heels. Each step carried the weight of her indignation, and each muttered word fueled the fire of her assumptions. "This is ridiculous," she hissed under her breath. Her words meant more for herself than anyone nearby. Who does she think she is? Walking into business class dressed like that? She barely glanced at the rows of passengers as she passed, but her clipped tone and irritated gestures did not go unnoticed. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging awkward glances. Others shook their heads, clearly annoyed by the commotion, but unwilling to intervene. Reaching the back of the cabin, Grace pushed aside a curtain that separated the galley from the main cabin and grabbed the in-flight phone. Her hand trembled slightly as she punched in the code to reach the cockpit, but whether it was from anger or a flicker of doubt, even she couldn't tell. "She must have snuck up here," she muttered as the phone rang. Her voice grew louder as if trying to convince herself. "There's no way someone dressed like that, wearing rags, could possibly afford a business class ticket." She glanced back through the curtain toward the elderly woman's seat, her lips curling in disdain. It's not just protocol, it's about standards. Before the captain could answer, Grace caught her reflection in a nearby stainless steel panel. Her neatly tied bun and pristine uniform reminded her of her authority, of the meticulous image she worked so hard to uphold. Straightening her posture, she forced a small, confident smile and adjusted the pin on her lapel, ready to justify her actions to the captain. But even as she prepared her speech, the cabin behind her was far from calm. The passengers in business class, who had initially treated the incident as mild entertainment, were growing restless. A man in his late 40s, dressed in a rumpled suit, sighed loudly as he tapped at his laptop. "Can we just get on with the flight?" he muttered, his irritation cutting through the low hum of murmurs. "Some of us have work to do." A woman across the aisle, her face covered by a luxurious silk sleep mask, sat up and glared toward the commotion. "Honestly, this is absurd," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "I paid for peace and quiet, not this drama." She waved a manicured hand in the air, as if dismissing the entire situation. Yet amidst the murmurs of discontent, a few passengers quietly observed the elderly woman. There was something magnetic about her calmness. While Grace had left in a whirlwind of indignation, the elderly woman had not moved an inch. She sat upright, her back straight, and her hands folded in her lap, as if she were waiting for a storm to pass. One passenger, a young man with glasses and a sketchbook, had been doodling throughout the flight. He looked up from his page, his eyes narrowing as he studied the elderly woman. "She doesn't seem like she snuck in," he murmured to his seatmate, a woman scrolling through her phone. "Doesn't matter," the woman replied without looking up. "If she doesn't belong here, she needs to move. End of story." The young man frowned, but said nothing more, returning to his sketch with a thoughtful expression. Back in the galley, Grace finally heard the click of the captain answering the line. "This is Captain Reynolds," came the calm, authoritative voice through the receiver. "What's the issue, Harper?" "Captain," Grace began, her tone firm and polished, "we have a situation in business class. There's an elderly woman seated in 3A who clearly doesn't belong here. She's dressed in inappropriate attire and refuses to move to economy. I believe she may have snuck in during boarding." There was a pause on the other end, long enough for Grace to glance over her shoulder toward the cabin, as if to emphasize her point. "Do you have her ticket?" the captain asked evenly. Grace hesitated, her fingers tightening around the phone. "She's holding on to it," she admitted reluctantly. "But she hasn't shown it to me. She's being uncooperative." "Grace," the captain's voice was calm but carried a warning edge. "If she has a ticket and it's for business class, this is a non-issue. We don't discriminate based on appearances." "But," Grace started, her face heating up. "No buts," the captain interrupted, his tone firm. "We've had complaints about how this airline treats its passengers. The last thing we need is another viral incident. Handle this delicately and check her ticket before jumping to conclusions. Understood?" Grace clenched her jaw. "Understood, Captain," she said tersely before hanging up. She stood in the galley for a moment, her hands resting on the counter, trying to compose herself. Her frustration hadn't ebbed. If anything, it had grown sharper. It wasn't just the elderly woman who infuriated her, it was the captain's refusal to back her up, the passengers' whispers, and the gnawing feeling that the situation was slipping out of her control. Brushing her hands down the front of her uniform, she forced herself to breathe deeply. "Fine," she muttered under her breath, her voice laced with determination. "I'll handle it my way." With a final glance at her reflection, Grace pushed through the curtain and returned to the cabin, her expression cold and resolute. But as she marched toward 3A, the murmurs around her grew louder. Passengers were now openly recording, their phones raised, and some were even whispering among themselves about the elderly woman. And the elderly woman? She hadn't moved a muscle. Her composure was unbroken, her eyes steady as Grace approached. The flight attendant stood before her once more, hands on her hips, and said in a low, cutting tone, "Let's see that ticket, now." The elderly woman raised her eyes, calm but unyielding. Slowly, she unfolded the ticket from her lap and held it out. Grace snatched it quickly, scanning the details with an eager sharpness. What she saw made her heart sink. It was a business class ticket, perfectly valid, with the elderly woman's name clearly printed in bold letters. For a moment, Grace froze. Around her, the cabin grew quieter, passengers leaning in to catch her reaction. She felt the weight of dozens of eyes and dozens of recording phones trained on her, waiting for her next move. Her confidence, which had been so unshakable moments ago, wavered, but instead of apologizing, she straightened her back and clenched her teeth. "Well," she said curtly, thrusting the ticket back toward the elderly woman, "I'll need to verify this with the gate records. Don't get too comfortable." With that, she turned sharply on her heel and walked away, leaving behind a growing sense among the passengers that this was far from over. The tension in the business class cabin had reached a boiling point. Passengers exchanged curious glances, their whispers buzzing like static in the air. Phones remained raised, capturing every moment of the unfolding drama. Grace Harper stood near the galley, her jaw tight and her composure visibly strained. She had thought the situation would be resolved quickly, but it had spiraled far beyond her control. The curtain separating the cockpit from the cabin swished open, and Captain Andrew Reynolds stepped into view. At 6 feet tall, with neatly combed silver hair and a crisp uniform adorned with golden stripes, he radiated an air of authority that immediately quieted the murmurs. His sharp blue eyes scanned the cabin, taking in the scene with a calm yet calculating expression. The captain moved down the aisle with measured strides, his presence commanding attention. The passengers straightened in their seats, their curiosity now mixed with anticipation. Grace hurried to meet him halfway, her face a mix of relief and nervousness. "Captain Reynolds," she began, her voice low but insistent. "Thank you for coming. I was just about to." He raised a hand to silence her. "Let me handle this," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Grace stepped aside, her lips pressed into a thin line as she watched him approach the elderly woman in seat 3A. The woman, still seated, looked up at the captain with calm, steady eyes. Her wrinkled hands rested lightly on her lap, and her posture was as straight and dignified as ever. The contrast between her composed demeanor and the tense atmosphere around her was striking. "Ma'am?" Captain Reynolds began, his voice even but respectful. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" The elderly woman nodded wordlessly and reached for her old, worn handbag. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried, as though she had all the time in the world. From the depths of the bag, she pulled out a wrinkled boarding pass, carefully folded and slightly smudged from being handled. She extended it toward the captain, her hand steady. Captain Reynolds took the boarding pass and unfolded it, his brow furrowing as he scanned the details. At first, his expression was neutral, his professional detachment firmly in place. But as his eyes moved down the paper, something shifted. His brows lifted slightly, his lips parted, and his grip on the boarding pass tightened. The cabin, already quiet, seemed to fall into an even deeper silence. Every passenger leaned forward, straining to catch a glimpse of the captain's reaction. Even Grace, who had been hovering near the galley, took a cautious step closer, her curiosity piqued. Captain Reynolds read the name on the boarding pass again, as if unable to believe his eyes. He glanced at the elderly woman, then back at the paper. His expression, initially one of curiosity, darkened into something that looked remarkably like fear. "Is there a problem, Captain?" Grace asked, her voice cutting through the silence. Reynolds didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to the elderly woman, his tone markedly softer. "Ma'am," he said, "please forgive the inconvenience. Could you confirm your name for me?" The elderly woman tilted her head slightly, her calm gaze never wavering. "My name is Margaret Sinclair," she said in a voice that was quiet but carried an undeniable weight. At the mention of her name, a ripple of recognition passed through a few passengers. Those who had been casually observing now sat up straighter, their eyes widening. Grace frowned, confused by the sudden change in the atmosphere. She opened her mouth to speak but stopped when Captain Reynolds abruptly turned toward her. "Miss Harper," he said, his tone sharp and commanding, "step into the galley. Now." Grace blinked, startled by his sudden authority. "But Captain—" "Now," he repeated, his voice brooking no argument. Flustered and visibly annoyed, Grace turned on her heel and retreated to the galley. The passengers watched her go, their curiosity only growing. Turning back to Margaret Sinclair, Captain Reynolds handed her the boarding pass with a slight bow of his head. "Mrs. Sinclair," he said, his voice tinged with both respect and apprehension, "I deeply apologize for this misunderstanding. You are, of course, entitled to your seat in business class." Margaret took the boarding pass and nodded, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Captain," she said simply. Reynolds hesitated, as though considering his next words carefully. Finally, he straightened and turned to address the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his authoritative voice carrying through the space, "I must ask that any recordings of this incident be deleted immediately. Mrs. Sinclair is a respected individual, and we will not tolerate any invasion of her privacy." A few passengers exchanged uneasy glances, lowering their phones reluctantly. The weight of the captain's words, combined with his commanding presence, left little room for defiance. Reynolds then nodded to Margaret once more before retreating toward the galley, where Grace was waiting with crossed arms and a defensive scowl. "Captain, what is going on?" she demanded the moment he stepped into the small space. Reynolds fixed her with a piercing stare. "Do you have any idea who that woman is?" he asked, his voice low but intense. Grace hesitated, her confidence faltering. "She's just some elderly passenger who clearly doesn't belong in business class." Reynolds exhaled sharply, his frustration evident. "Margaret Sinclair is one of our airline's largest shareholders. She practically owns a piece of this company. If word of this incident reaches the board, or worse, the media, you can kiss your career goodbye." Grace's face drained of color. She's what?" "You heard me," Reynolds said. "Now, I suggest you find a way to make amends, quietly, and pray that Mrs. Sinclair is as forgiving as she is patient." Grace stood frozen, her mind racing as the gravity of her actions sank in. Captain Andrew Reynolds stood frozen, his eyes shifting between the wrinkled boarding pass in his hand and the serene elderly woman seated before him. The name on the ticket seared into his mind, Margaret Sinclair. His pulse quickened, cold sweat forming on his brow. This wasn't just any name. It was a name that symbolized prestige, innovation, and legacy in the aviation industry. The truth hit him like a thunderclap. This wasn't merely a shareholder. This was the founder of the airline he was piloting. Margaret Sinclair, the visionary who had built the company from the ground up decades ago, sat calmly before him in business class, a quiet yet monumental reminder of the airline's origins. "Mrs. Sinclair," Reynolds stammered, his usual composure shattered. I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for this unacceptable situation. Please, on behalf of the entire crew, accept my sincerest apologies." His voice trembled, the words rushing out unevenly. Margaret met his gaze with steady, piercing eyes. She said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. It wasn't anger or disdain emanating from her. It was disappointment. The cabin was deathly quiet. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, phones momentarily forgotten. Even the sound of the engine seemed muted against the heavy atmosphere. Curiosity and unease filled the air as everyone grasped the gravity of the moment. At the back of the cabin, Grace Harper stood rigid, her face pale. She felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her, silently condemning her arrogance and poor judgment. Her earlier confidence had dissolved into sheer panic. Founder? The word echoed in her mind. That old woman is the founder of the airline? Captain Reynolds, desperate to salvage the situation, gestured for a flight attendant to bring water for Mrs. Sinclair. He crouched slightly to meet Margaret's eye level, his voice softening. "Mrs. Sinclair, I assure you, this is not reflective of our usual standards. I will personally ensure that those responsible for this misunderstanding are held accountable." Margaret finally spoke, her voice calm but resolute. "Captain Reynolds," she began, her tone carrying the weight of years of authority and experience. "Accountability is not what I seek right now." Reynolds blinked, unsure how to respond. Of course, Mrs. Sinclair. What can I do to make this right?" Margaret placed her hands on the armrests of her seat, sitting straighter. Her presence, understated yet commanding, seemed to fill the entire cabin. "This isn't about me," she said, her voice quiet but powerful. "This is about respect for every passenger, regardless of their appearance, their background, or their perceived status. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am," Reynolds replied quickly, his head nodding emphatically. She turned her gaze toward Grace, who flinched as though struck. Margaret's eyes held no malice, only a deep disappointment that cut deeper than any reprimand could. "And you, young lady," Margaret said, her words measured and deliberate, "have forgotten the very principles this airline was built upon. Dignity, compassion, and fairness. Tell me, do you think you've upheld those values today?" Grace opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss for words. Her mind raced, grasping for an explanation, an excuse, anything to justify her behavior, but nothing came. Instead, tears began to well up in her eyes as the weight of her actions settled heavily on her shoulders. I'm so sorry," Grace whispered, her voice barely audible. Margaret nodded slightly, her expression softening just a fraction. "Apologies are only the beginning," she said. "What matters is what you learn from this moment." The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. Some looked at Margaret with newfound admiration, while others shot disapproving glances at Grace. Several passengers who had chuckled earlier now hung their heads, ashamed of their own complicity in the humiliation Margaret had endured. Reynolds straightened, regaining some of his composure. "Mrs. Sinclair," he said, his voice more controlled, "please allow us to offer you every comfort for the remainder of the flight. We can upgrade you to first class immediately." Margaret raised a hand, cutting him off. "That won't be necessary," she said firmly. "I am comfortable here. Business class is precisely where I belong." Her words were a subtle but pointed reminder of her earlier mistreatment. Reynolds nodded, understanding that she was making a statement. Margaret then addressed the cabin, her voice carrying an authority that silenced the murmurs instantly. "Let this be a lesson for all of us," she said. "It costs nothing to treat others with kindness. Appearances can be deceiving, but respect should never be conditional." Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply with everyone present. The silence that followed was heavy but reflective. Margaret leaned back in her seat, adjusting the modest shawl draped over her shoulders. She glanced out the window, her expression serene once more, as though the incident had been merely a passing storm. As the captain returned to the cockpit, Grace lingered near the galley, struggling to compose herself. Her once pristine uniform now felt like a heavy burden, a reminder of her hubris. She knew that the moment the plane landed, her actions would have consequences, not just professionally, but personally as well. And as the flight continued, the passengers remained subdued, their attitudes forever altered by the revelation that the elderly woman they had judged so hastily was in fact the very heart and soul of the airline they had chosen to fly with. As the cabin returned to an uneasy quiet, Margaret Sinclair remained seated, her aged but steady hands folded neatly in her lap. She turned her gaze toward Grace Harper, the flight attendant, who now stood a few paces away, visibly trembling. The young woman's earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by shame that weighed on her like a heavy fog. Margaret's voice, soft yet firm, carried through the cabin. "Young lady," she began, her tone devoid of malice but laden with disappointment. "Do you truly believe it's acceptable to treat someone poorly simply because they don't fit your idea of who belongs in a seat like this?" Grace opened her mouth, but no words came out. She cast her eyes downward, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. Margaret continued, her voice unwavering. "I've seen people like you before, quick to judge, eager to dismiss. You believe that respect is something earned by wealth or appearances, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Respect is a right, not a privilege. It's owed to every human being, regardless of what they wear, where they come from, or what you assume about them." The weight of her words hung heavily in the air. Passengers who had previously been amused by the scene now looked away, ashamed of their earlier laughter. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their own behavior now under scrutiny in the court of conscience Margaret had convened. "Young lady," Margaret continued, her piercing gaze fixed on Grace, "tell me, what was it about me that made you think I didn't belong here? My age? My clothes? My demeanor?" Grace hesitated, her face pale. "I didn't mean to," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret leaned slightly forward, her calm yet commanding presence forcing Grace to look up. "You didn't mean to what? Humiliate me? Mock me? Assume that someone like me couldn't possibly be deserving of a seat in business class?" Grace's lips trembled. She wanted to apologize, to explain, but the words felt hollow in her throat. "I built this airline," Margaret said, her voice gaining a slight edge. "Every seat on this plane, from the cockpit to the economy section, exists because of years of my hard work and sacrifice. And yet, I didn't come here to demand special treatment. I came here as a passenger, just like anyone else. All I wanted was to sit quietly and enjoy my flight." Margaret's eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. "What you failed to understand, young lady, is that power and privilege don't give a person more value. The person sitting in economy class deserves the same respect as the person in the first-class suite. A uniform or title doesn't make someone more human or more deserving." The passengers in the cabin listened intently, the weight of Margaret's message sinking in. Some nodded in silent agreement, while others sat motionless, lost in thought. Margaret straightened in her seat, her hands resting on the armrests. "Grace," she said, addressing the flight attendant by name, "I'm not here to ruin your career. I don't believe in tearing people down when they make mistakes. But I do believe in accountability. Today you failed, not just as a representative of this airline, but as a human being." Tears streamed down Grace's face as she whispered, "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Sinclair. I truly am." Margaret nodded, her expression softening. "Apologies are important, Grace, but they're only the first step. The real work begins when you ask yourself, what can I do to ensure I never treat someone like this again? You must learn to see people, not stereotypes. You must remind yourself every day that respect is not conditional." The elderly woman's words struck a chord not just with Grace, but with everyone in the cabin. Passengers who had silently judged Margaret or laughed at her earlier found themselves questioning their own biases. One man seated nearby, a businessman in a tailored suit, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Sinclair," he said, his voice tentative, "if I may, I want to say that your words have been a wake-up call. I think many of us owe you an apology." Margaret looked at him and offered a faint smile. "It's never too late to change," she said simply. The cabin fell silent again, the atmosphere now one of reflection rather than tension. Grace stepped forward cautiously, her hands trembling as she reached for Margaret's tray table. "Would you like anything, Mrs. Sinclair?" she asked, her tone sincere and respectful. Margaret considered for a moment before replying, "A cup of tea, please, and perhaps some time for you to think about what we've discussed." Grace nodded, her face a mix of gratitude and humility. She turned to fulfill the request, yet her movements slower and more deliberate, as if she were trying to process the gravity of what had just happened. As Margaret settled back into her seat, she glanced around the cabin. The stares she received now weren't of mockery or judgment. They were of respect and admiration. She had turned an ugly moment into a powerful lesson, one that would linger long after the flight landed. Outside the window, the clouds parted, revealing a sunlit horizon. Margaret allowed herself a small smile, content in the knowledge that she had done more than claim her rightful place in business class. She had reminded everyone aboard of the simple yet profound truth. Humanity is measured not by status or wealth, but by how we treat one another. As Margaret Sinclair sat quietly sipping her tea, the weight of her words still hung heavy in the air. The passengers who had once found humor in the earlier chaos now looked uneasy, their gazes fixed on their laps or the windows, avoiding her altogether. The once bustling cabin had grown eerily quiet, save for the hum of the engines and the occasional clink of glasses from the galley. Seated across the aisle, Robert Hensley, the sharply dressed businessman who had initially chuckled at the confrontation, cleared his throat nervously. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together as if steadying himself for what he was about to say. "Mrs. Sinclair," he began, his voice low but clear, "I owe you an apology." Margaret turned her head, her calm eyes meeting his. She said nothing, letting the man continue. "I was wrong. I was wrong," he admitted, his tone filled with genuine remorse. "I sat here and watched that poor display of disrespect, and not only did I do nothing to stop it, I laughed. I let my assumptions and, well, my pride get the better of me. For that, I'm deeply sorry." Margaret regarded him for a moment, then offered a small nod. "Your apology is appreciated," she said, her voice measured. "But tell me, Mr. Hensley," he supplied. "Mr. Hensley," she continued, her tone soft but piercing, "would you have apologized if you hadn't learned who I was?" The question seemed to strike him like a blow. He hesitated, the gears turning visibly in his mind. Finally, he shook his head. I don't know," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret leaned slightly forward, her gaze unwavering. "That's precisely the problem, Mr. Hensley. Respect shouldn't be dependent on titles, wealth, or power. It should be a given, extended to everyone without hesitation or conditions. The person sitting next to you, whether they're a CEO or a janitor, deserves the same courtesy. Don't you agree?" Hensley nodded solemnly. "You're absolutely right," he said. "I have a lot to think about." Across the cabin, another passenger, a middle-aged woman dressed in designer attire, spoke up. "Mrs. Sinclair," she said, her voice tentative but sincere, "I think I owe you an apology as well. I didn't laugh, but I didn't say anything either. I just sat here and watched, and now I'm ashamed of myself for staying silent." Margaret shifted her gaze to the woman, offering a kind but knowing smile. It's not easy to speak up, especially in a room full of people who might judge you for doing so. But silence can be just as harmful as ridicule. It enables the very behavior we ought to stand against. The woman nodded, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "You're right. I'll remember this moment the next time I'm faced with a choice like that." The quiet agreement seemed to ripple through the cabin, each passenger reflecting on their own role in the events that had unfolded. The laughter, the judgment, the indifference, all of it now felt unbearably small in the face of Margaret's quiet dignity and wisdom. In the back of the cabin, a younger man, casually dressed and clearly uncomfortable, spoke up hesitantly. "Mrs. Sinclair," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," Margaret replied, her tone inviting. "Why didn't you just tell her who you were from the beginning? I mean, you could have shut the whole thing down in a second." Margaret took a moment to consider the question. "Because," she began, "it shouldn't matter who I am. If I had revealed my identity right away, would the lesson have been learned? Would the flight attendant, and everyone else here, have stopped to think about why their behavior was wrong? Or would they simply have adjusted their actions because of my status?" The young man nodded, her words resonating deeply. I guess I never thought about it that way. Margaret smiled gently. That's the challenge we all face. It's easy to show respect to those we perceive as powerful or important. The true test of character is how we treat those we assume have nothing to offer us. The cabin fell silent again, her words sinking in like a stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples of her wisdom seemed to reach every corner of the room, stirring self-reflection in each passenger. Even Grace Harper, the flight attendant who had sparked the incident, lingered near the galley, her face still pale and tear-streaked. She stepped forward tentatively, addressing the cabin. "I need to say something," she began, her voice trembling but determined. "To all of you, and especially to Mrs. Sinclair, I'm sorry. My behavior was inexcusable. I judged her based on her appearance, and I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. I don't expect forgiveness, but I promise to do better." The passengers, now united in their shared discomfort and newfound awareness, offered a small round of polite applause. It wasn't much, but it was a gesture of support for Grace's acknowledgement of her mistakes. Margaret nodded approvingly. "Acknowledging your mistakes is the first step, Grace. The next step is making sure you don't repeat them." The rest of the flight passed in a subdued yet contemplative atmosphere. Passengers who had been strangers before now exchanged quiet words, discussing what they had learned from the experience. Margaret, meanwhile, returned to her tea, her presence no longer a spectacle, but a quiet reminder of the humanity that bound them all together. As the plane began its descent, the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm golden light over the clouds. Margaret gazed out the window, her expression serene. She had set out that morning, expecting an ordinary flight, but she had instead left an indelible mark on a room full of strangers. And as the wheels touched down on the runway, it was clear that the lesson she had imparted would extend far beyond the confines of that airplane. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the atmosphere in the cabin remained heavy. Grace Harper, the flight attendant whose actions had set the entire incident in motion, stood at the front of the business class section, visibly trembling. Her once pristine uniform now seemed to weigh her down, the gold stripes on her cuffs a stark contrast to her shaken demeanor. "Mrs. Sinclair," she began, her voice cracking as she addressed the elderly woman seated near the window. "I want to say how deeply sorry I am for the way I treated you. There's no excuse for my behavior." Margaret Sinclair looked up from her teacup, her calm expression unchanging. She set the cup down with deliberate care before meeting Grace's gaze. "You're apologizing," she said softly. "But I need to ask you, are you sorry for what you did? Or are you sorry because you've been exposed?" The question hit Grace like a tidal wave. Her lips parted as though to respond, but no words came. She stood frozen, her chest rising and falling as she struggled to gather her thoughts. The cabin was silent. Every passenger was watching, their earlier judgments and mockery replaced by a keen interest in Margaret's quiet authority. Finally, Grace managed to speak. I didn't realize it would escalate like this. I didn't mean to." Margaret raised a hand gently, stopping her. "You didn't mean to be held accountable," she finished for her. Her tone was not harsh, but neither was it forgiving. It was the tone of a teacher guiding a student through a difficult lesson. "Tell me, Grace, did it not cross your mind, even for a moment, that your actions were wrong?" Grace's hands trembled as she clasped them together. Tears began to pool in her eyes, threatening to spill over. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I thought I was just doing my job, making sure the right people were in the right places. But the truth is, I assumed. I assumed that someone who looked like you couldn't possibly belong here, and I was wrong." Margaret's gaze softened slightly, though her posture remained firm. "And why did you assume that?" Grace hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. Because of the way you were dressed. And because I've been conditioned to associate wealth and success with a certain image. I thought I was protecting the integrity of this cabin, but I see now how shallow that thinking was." Margaret leaned back in her seat, studying the young woman carefully. "You've been honest," she said at last, "and that's a start. But let me tell you something, Grace. Prejudice doesn't always announce itself with hatred or malice. Often it hides in the small, seemingly insignificant assumptions we make every day. And those assumptions, when left unchecked, can lead to moments like this, moments that hurt, divide, and humiliate. Tears streamed down Grace's face now, and she quickly wiped them away with the back of her hand. "I don't know how to make this right," she said, her voice breaking. "You can't undo what's been done," Margaret replied gently, "but you can choose how you move forward. Learn from this, Grace. Challenge those assumptions, and most importantly, treat every person you meet with the respect and dignity they deserve, not because of who they are, but because of who you are." Grace nodded, her tears falling freely. "I will," she whispered. "I promise." Margaret's expression softened further, and she gave a slight nod. "I believe you mean that," she said. "But promises are just words until they're put into action. I hope, for your sake, that this lesson stays with you long after this flight has landed." As Grace stepped back, passengers exchanged quiet glances. Many of them had witnessed the same moment of self-realization in themselves just hours earlier, as Margaret's words had laid bare their own complicity. From the middle of the cabin, a voice spoke up, a young woman who had recorded part of the incident on her phone. "Mrs. Sinclair," she said hesitantly, "I think this isn't just a lesson for Grace. It's a lesson for all of us." Margaret turned to her, her lips curving into a faint smile. "It is," she agreed, "and it's a lesson worth remembering." The plane came to a stop at the gate, and the passengers began gathering their belongings. But unlike most flights, where the rush to disembark was marked by a clamor of voices and impatience, this one was subdued. People moved quietly, many pausing to glance at Margaret Sinclair, their faces reflecting gratitude, regret, and respect. Grace stood by the exit, her posture less rigid than before. As Margaret approached, she hesitated, then said, "Thank you for everything you said. I'll carry it with me." Margaret nodded, her gaze warm but steady. "See that you do." As she stepped off the plane, Margaret didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew the lessons she had imparted would linger in that cabin, shaping the lives of everyone who had witnessed her quiet strength and unwavering principles. As the plane came to a complete stop at the gate, the last of the passengers began to gather their belongings, but the lingering tension from earlier in the flight was palpable. There was no hurried rush to leave. The usual sense of urgency had been replaced by a reflective quiet. The crew stood near the aisles, their faces grave, no longer simply performing their duties, but perhaps questioning their own behavior and attitudes. Captain Jonathan Pierce, his usually confident demeanor now tempered by the weight of the situation, stood by the door as the final passengers exited. His posture was resolute, a stark contrast to his earlier uncertainty when he had first realized the identity of Margaret Sinclair. His eyes met hers as she passed by, and for a moment their gazes locked. He gave a respectful nod, his expression one of deep apology. "Mrs. Sinclair," he began, his voice firm but full of remorse. "I owe you an apology for what happened today. I will be taking immediate disciplinary action against the flight attendant, and I assure you that this will be addressed within the airline. We're going to reevaluate our training procedures, and most importantly, the core values we're instilling in our staff." Margaret nodded silently, her gaze unwavering. She had said what needed to be said, and now it was time for action. The captain's words, though sincere, were simply the beginning of the change that needed to unfold. The crew, having witnessed firsthand the consequences of their actions, would need to reflect and reconsider the way they viewed their passengers, their responsibilities, and the impact their behavior could have. It was not enough for them to simply apologize. It was time for the airline to take a hard look at its culture. Turning slowly, Margaret made her way back to her seat, her movements deliberate and calm. As she passed through the aisles, there was no longer any of the sneers or dismissive glances from the passengers who had earlier mocked her. Instead, they shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes following her with a mixture of shame and newfound respect. They no longer saw the elderly woman in the faded dress, but the woman who had reminded them of their own humanity, their own blind spots. As Margaret sat down, she took a deep breath, allowing the stillness of the moment to wash over her. She could feel the weight of their stares, but this time they were different. They were no longer tainted with judgment, but with understanding. A few rows back, the young woman who had recorded part of the incident earlier approached. Her expression was apologetic, but her eyes were filled with gratitude. Mrs. Sinclair, she said quietly, I'm so sorry for what happened. You were right, of course. We all owe you an apology. But thank you. Thank you for teaching us this lesson. I won't forget it. Margaret smiled gently at the young woman, her voice soft but resolute. No one is beyond learning, she replied. But it's the action that follows that makes the difference. Make sure you carry this lesson with you and don't let it fade with time. As the last of the passengers disembarked, the flight attendants began to speak in low tones, sharing their own thoughts on the matter. Grace Harper, still visibly shaken but now standing with her colleagues, looked over at Margaret one final time. Her earlier defiance had been replaced by a quiet humility, the weight of her actions fully sinking in. Margaret's words had not only forced her to confront her own prejudice, but also opened her eyes to the systemic issues that had allowed it to flourish unchecked. At the front of the plane, the captain turned to his crew. "This isn't over," he said firmly. "We have a responsibility to every passenger on this flight, no matter who they are or how they look. We'll be conducting a series of workshops and reviews. I expect everyone to take part, to understand what went wrong, and to ensure it never happens again." The flight attendants nodded in agreement, their faces serious. It was clear that this was no mere formality. The incident had left a scar on the airline's reputation, and now they would have to prove that they were truly committed to change. As Margaret's seatbelt sign flickered on and the cabin crew prepared for landing, she felt a sense of quiet pride. The lesson had been difficult, even painful for everyone involved, but it had been necessary. The truth had come to light, and now there was no turning back. There was no easy way to erase the harm done, but the seeds for change had been planted, and she hoped that this would mark the beginning of a broader shift, one that would extend beyond the walls of this flight, beyond the company, and into the world at large. The plane touched down with a soft thud, the wheels kissing the runway. As it taxied to the gate, the usual rush to stand and gather bags began. But the passengers, each of them now weighed with the understanding of the lesson they had learned, moved more slowly. There was no longer any sense of entitlement or impatience. For a moment, it seemed as though the world had paused, a brief interlude in the noise of daily life where people remembered what truly mattered. Margaret Sinclair stood and collected her belongings, her gaze sweeping across the cabin. She saw no more disdain, no more mockery, only the quiet reflection of people who had been forced to confront their own prejudices. When she stepped off the plane and made her way into the terminal, she did not look back. The moment was over, but the ripple effects would continue to spread. Change, once ignited, could never be contained. Margaret knew this better than anyone. And with that knowledge, she stepped into the future, her head held high, knowing that she had made a difference. Not just for herself, but for everyone she had touched. As Margaret Sinclair disappeared into the bustling crowd of the airport terminal, the echoes of her lesson lingered in the air. It wasn't just the flight attendants or the passengers on that plane who had been transformed. It was everyone who had witnessed or heard about the incident. The story, like a stone cast into a still pond, had ripples that spread far beyond the confines of the flight. People would talk about it, reflect on it, and perhaps, just perhaps, start to change their own attitudes. For Margaret, it wasn't about the apology or the newfound respect. It wasn't even about the power she held or the wealth she had accumulated through her lifetime of hard work. It was about something far more profound, the recognition that every human being, regardless of their appearance, background, or status, deserves to be treated with dignity. She had done her part to remind others of that truth. The rest, as she knew all too well, was up to them. As she walked through the terminal, she allowed herself a brief, quiet smile. The day had been difficult, but it had been worth it. In that fleeting moment, she knew she had changed something in the world. Something deep, something lasting. And that, she thought, was the greatest victory of all. The world would continue to spin, the daily grind would resume, but the lesson had been learned. Respect isn't a privilege, it's a right. And as Margaret left behind the noise of the airport and stepped into the quiet of the world outside, she knew that for at least a few people, the world would never be the same again. Thank you so much for sticking with us through this story and taking the time to watch the video. We hope it gave you something to think about and sparked a conversation about respect, dignity, and the importance of treating others with kindness, no matter their background. If you enjoyed the story, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Your support helps us continue to bring you meaningful content. Also, hit that notification bell so you never miss out on any of our future videos. Thanks again for being part of this journey, and we look forward to sharing more stories with you soon. Stay respectful, stay kind, and take care. Thank you for watching. Please note, this video was generated using AI technology to read the story. While we strive for accuracy and clarity, there may be occasional errors or mispronunciations. We kindly ask for your understanding and patience if any mistakes occur. If you notice any issues or areas for improvement, feel free to leave a comment below. Your feedback is invaluable and will help us enhance the quality of our future videos. We appreciate your support and engagement. Thank you for being part of our community. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content, and we'll see you in the next video.